Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm very happy to welcome you to the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture. And Barbara Lesh McCaffrey, the president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, who supports this lecture, is going to tell you a little bit about Robert L. Harris and what he has done to make sure this lecture series is a continuing success. And then I will introduce you to Professor Peter Hayes.
Thank you. As the president of the board of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, it's an honor to introduce the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture and to provide information about Robert L. Harris and the community group that supports this unique course. Robert was a World War II vet who retired and moved with his wife Claire to Sonoma County after a distinguished career in school teaching and administration. For many years, a group in Petaluma had coordinated an annual Warsaw Ghetto Uprising remembrance event that then became an annual Yom HaShoah or Holocaust commemoration. The university president, Peter Diamandopoulos, was the keynote speaker in 1983. And after the event, he challenged Robert, who was that year's coordinator, to do more than just memorialize the Holocaust at an annual event. SSU was an ideal place for the permanent program about the Holocaust because Professor John Steiner, a Holocaust survivor and professor of sociology, had begun to teach classes dealing with issues related to the Holocaust. Additionally, both Professor Paul Benko, a Holocaust survivor and faculty member in our biology department, and Professor George Jackson, a liberator and faculty member in the psychology department, were also at Sonoma State. During the spring of 1983, Robert asked a number of people to assist him in responding to the president's challenge. I wish it were so easy because what he would say is, $50 please, $100 please, and it was a much less complex process. The founding board member, Sylvia Suker, remembered Robert as an indefatigable leader with enormous determination who was able to work with all types of people. A true inspiration. As Joel Newberg, a past Alliance board president, recalled, Robert was a one-person organization. He knew what needed to be done, how to interface with individuals and groups, and how to handle all the fundraising. He simply would ask, and people would donate. The Alliance was formed in 1983 on behalf of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and a desire to tell their stories and learn from their experiences. Those who began this collaborative effort between the community and members of the university faculty promised to let the world know of the atrocities that had occurred. The initial intention was primarily to learn the facts, act on them, and never forget. As a result of these efforts, a highly successful lecture series on the Holocaust and Genocide, now in its 37th year, was created at Sonoma State University. It initially included 5 to 6 lectures a year and grew into this upper division general education course that currently enrolls 100 students annually. Almost from its inception, the series included lectures on other genocides as well as the Holocaust. Professor Steiner became the first director of the center and was succeeded by Professor Emerita Myrna Goodman, who had been the first student assistant hired by the center in 1987. As a university community partnership, it was the university's role to cover the faculty salaries and the Alliance to raise the majority of the money to bring the speakers to the university, and that has continued to this day. The board includes members of the community, university faculty, and administrators, and students who've participated in the lecture series. Its current mission is to co-sponsor the lecture series, support the Center for the Study on the Holocaust and Genocide in providing programming to the larger community, including secondary school teachers, and to collaborate with other community groups working with issues related to the Holocaust and Genocide. In 2010, the name of the Alliance was changed to the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide to reflect its continuing educational commitment to include all those affected by genocide. And 3 years ago, the Alliance Education Committee expanded to include outreach to local middle and high school principals and teachers, coordinating lectures by Holocaust and Genocide survivors and their descendants, and recruiting and training survivors and descendants who had not previously spoken to student groups. After Robert's death, the members of the Alliance decided to name an annual lecture in this series as a tribute to his unswerving dedication and commitment to Holocaust education. We're truly indebted to Robert for his vision and his leadership. We are grateful to all of the past and former and current members of the Alliance, to the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the Peninsula, Marin, and Sonoma counties, who've generously been underwriting this series since 2009, and also to Professor Diane Parness, who serves as the academic coordinator for the series. And we're grateful to have Pearl and David Furman with us today, who have underwritten today's lecture. Thank you. The Alliance also co-sponsors an annual community-wide commemoration of the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah, with other organizations in Sonoma County. This year's program will be held on Sunday, May 5th from 2 to 4 in Santa Rosa. The theme is L'Dor V'Dor, from generation to generation. We hope that you'll be able to join us. Copies of the flyer for the commemoration will be available at the lectures starting next week, and we'll also ask the faculty to share it with their students. If any college or high school students with us today are interested in serving as escorts for the Holocaust survivors who will be lighting candles at that event, please see me either today or at one of the lectures in the coming weeks. Thank you very much.
Well, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Peter Hayes to this, for the first time, to this lecture series. His visit is long overdue, and we're equally pleased that he is offering the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture. Professor Hayes' specialties are the histories of the Holocaust and of Nazi Germany. For 36 years, he taught these subjects at Northwestern University, and I would say that's tremendous stamina, but I'm right behind you, so never mind. At Northwestern, he was awarded, I think, every award for excellence in teaching that. He is currently the chair of the academic committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Professor Hayes is the author or editor of 12 books to date. Most recently, he has produced 3 major works on the Holocaust: the Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies, which he co-edited with John Roth, How Was It Possible? A Holocaust Reader, and the analytical synthesis, Why? Explaining the Holocaust. He is currently at work on Prophets and Persecution, German Big Business in the Third Reich, which is to be published by Cambridge University Press. He just informed me that he is at work with Christopher Browning, who's familiar to you, on a new book about the logistics of the Holocaust, which promises to be fascinating. Today, we look forward to his approach to explaining the most fundamental question about the Holocaust: why? Please welcome Professor Peter Hayes.
Thank you all very much. I mean, clearly, good? Can you? No. Huh? We'll see. I'm much more comfortable doing this than being Phil Donahue, but that's Phil Donahue. Nah, you're too young for that, right? Okay. Anyway, thank you all for your invitation. When I was 8 years old, my dad was stationed at the air base in Sacramento. And so I lived there for 5 months and went to elementary school. And since then, I have never been in Northern California. So, and you say to yourself, how is that possible? How can you get to be 72 years old and you've never been to Northern California since you were in the 3rd grade? I don't know how that was possible, but it's really nice to be here. I have learned a lot about this part of the country, and I envy you. I taught for 36 years in a very cold and snowy place. All right, and apropos that, the story of this book that I wrote has a lot to do with where I taught. Because when I was coming up toward retiring in 2015, it dawned on me that I was in a position to write not just a new history of the Holocaust, but a new kind of history of the Holocaust. And I was in that position because I had had to adapt to the crazy practices of the institution where I taught. You go to real college. You have semesters. Northwestern, Chicago, UCLA, I think San Diego. They have something called quarter system. Northwestern has this. I used to say it should be called the drawn and quartered system. Because what I had to do as a teacher is I had to teach the history of the Holocaust. I did it 25 times. And the history of the Holocaust is a subject with very long antecedents. To find out why it happened, you have to go back in history a good distance. And then it's a painful and intricate subject. And then the aftermath has not been simple either. And I had to try to figure out how to fit this into what was nominally 11 weeks of a quarter. But it wasn't even 11 weeks. Incidentally, I said I would be thirsty, and this is really estimating how thirsty I'll get. So I had a quarter of 11 weeks. But it's not really 11 weeks, because 1 week is reserved for final exams, 10. And at Northwestern, we were a very student-friendly institution. So another week is reserved for reading week, which is when the students get to read the stuff that they should have been reading in the preceding 9 weeks. And you have to give a midterm exam. So I had 8.5 weeks to teach the history of the Holocaust. And when I started doing it in 1987, the first 4 or 5 years, I was never happy with what I did. I always got to the end of the course and said, but I left this out, and I left that out, and I didn't get to that, and so on. It was like the proverbial blanket that is too small for the bed. You move it one way, and your shoulders are covered, but your toes are exposed. And the other way, you got it. Okay. And then, along about year 6, I began to realize that I should pay attention to what my students were telling me. Because in the beginning, the course had about 75 students in it. And I taught all the discussion sections on Friday afternoon. So I would do them one after another. I was younger and more vigorous then. And I would ask them in the early weeks of the course, why are you here? Why'd you take this? What is it that you are expecting to find out? And they would say, I want to know this and this and this. And in the first 4 or 5 years, what they wanted to know was very consistent. And the questions they posed were very much like the questions that adult audiences posed when I went out and lectured to them about the Holocaust. And I realized that those questions were almost exactly what I needed to teach 8 weeks of classes. That if I devoted 1 week to each of the central questions that they posed year after year, that they would always know what we're trying to figure out. I would know what to include and what not to include, because I was stuck. These are the things I'm trying to explain. And this would sort the information for them and solve my problem of coverage. Now the questions, when I recite them to you, they'll seem familiar. Why the Jews? Why was this group of people the principal target of an unprecedented onslaught of hatred only 75 to 80 years ago? Why the Germans? Why was that the nationality that inflicted this atrocity? If you had asked people in 1905, well, let's say 1903, just to make it easy, which country on this continent in 40 years is going to be killing and burning the bodies of Jews? In 1903, people would have said, Russia, France. Germany would not have been the top candidate. How come? Why the Germans? Why murder? The Nazis came to power telling the Germans, we want to remove these people. The German word is entfernen, to remove. We want to remove these people from our society because they're allegedly dangerous. Okay? Well, remove can mean a lot of things. If I say I want to remove this rostrum from the stage, I can pick it up and carry it out the door. I can also pretend like I'm a rock star and throw it down and smash it. It can mean different things to different audiences. Why does it come to mean murder for them? Why do they carry out the murder so fast and so sweepingly? And we always say that there were 6 million Jews who were killed in the Holocaust, and that was 2/3 of the Jews of Europe in 1939. It's worse than that. The Nazis killed 3/4 of the Jews that ever came within their reach. That is, many of the survivors never were behind German lines. And they did it in an incredibly short period of time. You may think of the Holocaust as 1933 to 45, Hitler's rule. You may think of it as, okay, 1938 to 45, from the time of the burning of the synagogues to the end of Hitler's rule. You may think of it as 1941 to 45, 41 being the onset of mass murder. In fact, half the victims died in the space of only 11 months. 3 million people died between March of 1942 and February of 1943. At the high point, the Germans were killing 350,000 people a month. More than 1,000 people a day. How could they carry this out so fast and reach so large a proportion of the target population? The question I always used to hate the most, but it was irresistible for my students, why didn't more fight back? I used to say this is because I teach in America. And in America, we all think that, you know, if we're faced with atrocity or danger, we're all going to behave like Davy Crockett at the Alamo. But it's a very easy assumption. And I used to say to my students when they would ask this question, why didn't more fight back? I would look back and facetiously I would say, have you ever seen a tank? You ever been on the receiving end of a flamethrower? That helps you to clarify why more people didn't fight back. But still, the answer is more complicated than that. Why did survival rates vary by country? You know, this overall figure, 75% of the Jews that they ever got their hands on, they killed. But 75% of the Jews of France survived. 75% of the Jews in the Netherlands, almost right next door to France, were killed. What's the difference? 80% of the Jews in the path of the Romanian army that advanced into Russia with the Germans were slaughtered. 80% of the Jews who lived in Romania, the territory of Romania when the war began, were still there in 1945. How do you explain such variation? Why did Jews get so little help? Why could so few of them get away in the 1930s? And why wasn't there more interference with the killing once it started? And then finally, of course, the question that, this is the 8th question, what is always the hardest one to answer, is what are we supposed to learn from this subject? What are we supposed to take away, and what's the value that pays us back for immersing ourselves in the horrible nature of what we find out about human beings when you study the Holocaust? Well, there you were. I had my 8 questions. And if you look at my book, you'll see that there are 8 chapters, and that 7 of the chapters have 2 sections, and 1 chapter has 3. That was the lecture before the midterm exam. So I got this into the 8.5 weeks. I do 2 lectures a week, and what this book has become is those 2 lectures have turned into the parts of each chapter, and that's it. Now, I can't take you through all of the 8 questions today. It would take way too long and so forth. But I can give you an idea of how I try to approach these things and what the thrust of the book is by reducing the questions we're going to talk about to 2. Why were Jews killed? And why couldn't or didn't anyone stop it? Now, to try to explain the question of why Jews were killed, you have to go back a very long time, because the answer is actually rooted, unfortunately, in the beginning of Christianity. There are signs of hostility to Jews in ancient texts before the birth of Christ and the rise of the Christian religion. But they do not depict Jews as uniquely dangerous or conspiratorial or threatening. They are just a nationality of the ancient world like every other nationality. What made the Jews different was the rise of a new religion which built upon Judaism, but claimed to improve it. After all, the central teachings of Christianity are the central teachings of Judaism. Monotheism, one God. Scripture, that is, the texts that are written down are the revelation of God to people. Covenant, God makes an arrangement with his people for their salvation. And what Christianity did is it took all of these central notions, changed them, because after all, Christianity believes in monotheism, but it's one God in 3 forms, the Trinity. It believes in Scripture. The Hebrew Bible is the Old Testament, but then come the Gospels and the Epistles, which also claim in the New Testament to be a new revelation of God's purpose. Covenant. The existence of the Jewish people is based on pacts, treaties, between the people and the divinity. God says to the Jews, I will make you a light unto the nations in return for you obeying my laws. And we all know the 10 Commandments are where these laws start. But they proliferate in the books of the Torah, or the Hebrew Bible, to 613 prohibitions and requirements. Now, Christianity came along, improved upon all of this, and it said, or claimed to improve upon all of this, and said, the Trinity is better than monotheism. Both testaments are better than just the Old. And the New Covenant, you can be saved not by virtue of agreeing to the 613 laws, because the New Testament emancipates people from some of those laws. You will be saved, you will be one with the Lord if you accept the teachings of the new religion. Now, who are the Jews? They are fundamentally the people who said no. They are the people who said, when Christianity came into the world and said, we have improved upon the old, the Jews said, no thank you. We're just fine. And what this meant in the first centuries of the Common Era, up until the time that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, is that these two faiths were in constant competition. And Christians, once they acquired power and became the official religion, set up all kinds of institutions to put the Jews in boxes so they would not undermine the faith of everybody else. So the people who said no would not influence the people who had said yes. And the boxes were residential. Jews had to live in ghettos. They were occupational. Jews could only do certain things. They couldn't own land. They could lend money. They couldn't hold high office. They could be tanners and itinerant traders and so on. Now, this whole system was designed to create a world in which Jews were restricted, treated discriminatorily, and the purpose was to show this is what happens if you say no. To show the superiority of the new faith, you made the adherents of the old faith suffer. And this is the origin of the discrimination and the restrictions and so forth that Jews for centuries had to endure. This is also the legacy of Christianity to European culture. For almost 1,400 years, the prevailing relationship between Jews and the larger population among which they lived was that they were kept in these boxes and restricted and regarded as contaminating, potentially contaminating to the faith of everyone else. Now this changes, of course, with the 18th century. It changes with documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, in which all men are created equal, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, in which all human beings have access to equal rights. It even changes thanks to an Austrian emperor who decides that keeping the Jews in boxes reduces how much revenue he can get out of them. So he should open up the restrictions, make them able to do all the things that everybody else can do, because they'll be more taxable. And this leads to the Edicts of Tolerance in the Austrian Empire in the 1780s. And then, of course, the French Revolution leads to the armies of Napoleon going all across Europe, and wherever they went, they emancipated the Jews. They freed the Jews from these centuries of restrictions. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because modern hostility to Jews actually got a modern name. What we refer to as anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews, did not under that name exist until 1879. The word was coined in that year. And it was coined as a reaction against emancipation. It was the ideology of people who said, whatever is going wrong for you now, you know what caused it? We let them out of the boxes. When we allowed them to have equal rights and to do the things that the rest of us do, in fact, when we allowed them to compete with us for positions at universities or for jobs in law firms or to become professors like me, when we did that, we introduced an alien element back into European life, and that element has been corrupting. Anti-Semitism as an ideology is built around that. It is a reaction to the emancipation of Jews at the beginning of the 19th century, and it is a movement that develops in the 19th century in most countries of Europe, because in most countries of Europe there is always some population that is looking for an explanation of what ails them, is looking for a convenient and easy way of saying what's gone wrong. Now, I used to, I taught in the American Midwest, but you know, Sonoma is an agricultural region. I used to explain this to my students by saying that in the 1880s, a loaf of bread baked in Berlin, made from wheat grown outside of Minneapolis. You with me so far? Berlin's in the middle of Europe, Minneapolis is in the middle of North America. A loaf of bread baked in Berlin, made out of wheat grown outside of Minneapolis, would be cheaper than a loaf of bread made from rye grown within 100 miles of Berlin. How's that possible? Well, if you go to Berlin and you go out into the countryside and you put your hand down in the soil, you will have a day at the beach. It's sandy. In fact, one of the famous Prussian kings referred to that area as a sandbox. The area outside of Minneapolis is no sandbox. And when you put seeds in the ground, you get such an enormous production outside of Minneapolis that every acre is generating enormous quantities that can be sold for less per unit than the ones outside of Berlin. And then in the 19th century, the railroad rates from Berlin to Chicago, from Minneapolis to Chicago, and then from Chicago to New York, and then on the ships across to the port of Hamburg, and then on barges up the river from Hamburg to Berlin, all of that was cheaper than carting the rye from 100 miles outside on carts into Berlin. Now, bear with me for a minute. Why is this relevant to anti-Semitism? Because a lot of farmers in the middle of Europe were going out of business at the end of the 19th century. And they were going out of business for this reason. And rather than understand what I just explained to you, that it's all about bushels per acre and cheap transportation costs and the low productivity of your land, they preferred to believe it's all about the Jewish grain brokers who are cheating us. You see how much easier that is to figure out? And so there's an audience for people who say, I know who's doing stuff to you, the Jews. Now, in 19th century Europe, there were always authors who were prepared to peddle this line, and a lot of people were willing to buy the books or read the newspapers and so forth. But the ironic part of the story is that this movement was never very politically successful. In the elections of the German Empire from 1871 to 1912, people who ran for office saying the Jews are the problem never got more than 5% of the vote, and they never got more than 5.5% of the seats in the parliament. A lot of people listened to this simple explanation, but they didn't vote that way. Okay? And often the reason was because when one part of the country was hurting, like the sandbox outside of Berlin, other parts of the country were doing very well, and they weren't looking for explanations about who's doing this to you. So up until 1912, all across Europe, there are people who are arguing that emancipation was a mistake, Jews are alien, they have to be confined again. It's in the air, it's talked about, but it never acquires power anywhere. So flash forward, I said to you 1912 is the last parliamentary election in the German Empire. Flash forward 20 years. In 1932, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party, whose central principle is they're the problem, gets 37% of the vote in German parliamentary elections. 5% to 37%. And 6 months later, he comes to power. He's named prime minister of the country, chancellor. And he turns the country within 6 months into a one-party dictatorship, mostly by violence and intimidation and so forth. All right? Now, how do you get from 5% to 37% in 20 years? How does anti-Semitism go from being a loud and marginal movement to one that the most powerful country on the European continent, the country that had produced the most Nobel Prizes up to that point, a very highly educated society, how do you get it that this becomes the dominant ideology of the country? Now, the short answer is you beat up on that country pretty badly. I mean, after all, the Germans were humiliated by the loss of World War I. They were then subjected to the removal of virtually all their armed forces. A fine was imposed upon them that if they had paid it, they would have still been paying into the 1950s. Okay? And they were deeply divided. There was almost a communist revolution. There was a very strong communist movement in the country, which scared a lot of people. Then in 1923, their government, in order to pay that fine, inflated the currency, because the only way it could figure out how to pay what it was due every month, they couldn't sell more goods abroad because other countries jacked up their tariffs. They couldn't borrow money to pay the bills because nobody trusted them. And so they printed money. And in 1923, the German mark, which was the unit of currency, which in 1914 was worth a quarter to the dollar. In 1923, it was worth, I'm not making this up, 4.2 trillion to the dollar. It was literally not worth the paper it was printed on. And by various financial mechanisms, they pull out of that crisis. They solve that, and 5 years later, the Depression hits. And the Depression hit Germany harder than any country in the world, including us. The stock market went down further, the unemployment percentage went up higher, the GDP fell further, so forth. Now, this is an environment in which there were more and more people susceptible to the message that desperate times demand desperate measures, and particularly susceptible to another message. This is not your fault. The misery you are experiencing is not not some result of your mistakes. You launched World War I and you lost, or you elected bad leaders. It's not your fault. Somebody did this to you. And the Nazis ran on the very flattering message, your misery is not your fault, I know who did it to you, and I know how to fix it. We'll get rid of them. We'll get rid of the leftists, the commies, we'll get rid of the Jews, and we'll tell the Allies to go away. We'll simply defy, we'll refuse to make those payments, we'll refuse to submit to all the things they've done to it. We will be, as the Germans said, wir sind wieder wer. We're somebody again. We'll stand up against the world and we'll show them. Now this is essentially the mission, the message that Hitler ran on. And he got 37% of the vote. He got more people in Germany supporting him than any other party. But 37% is not 51%. And in fact, when Hitler was appointed to power, it's remarkable how much research has gone into this, but we know an awful lot about who voted for whom in the early 1930s. When Hitler came to power, roughly 55% of the Germans had never voted for him. So the history of anti-Semitism tells us where he got this crazy grab bag of ideas about these people are responsible. But he wasn't brought to power by the fact that all Germans were enthusiastic about those ideas. He was brought to power because they wanted somebody to solve the problems. They were not convinced that any of the other political parties offered a convincing message. And the Nazis conveyed an image of strength and an explanation for what was happening, and so on. Now, why does this matter? Well, because if he wasn't brought to power by his message that the Jews are the problem, 10 years later, most Germans were behaving as if the Jews were the problem. And I always illustrate this with an unusual example, but I wrote 2 books about big chemical companies in Germany. And one of the interesting things about them was, one of them was a huge company called IG Farben, which made everything but the kitchen sink. And the other was a company called Degussa, which stands for German Gold and Silver Separation Institute, metal smelting, precious metals. In 1932, between those two companies, they had something like 44, 45 members of their boards of directors. Not a single Nazi. Not a one. In 1942, they are already up to their armpits in the Holocaust. The IG Farben company agrees to build a factory just outside of Auschwitz to produce chemicals, and they build it in part with slave labor. Degussa, I just told you what its name is, German Gold and Silver Separation Institute. Guess what they did? They smelted all the gold and the silver stolen from Jews all over Europe, including from the mouths of their corpses, and turned that into ingots and bars that could be traded internationally, or actually a lot of it was traded internationally. It was actually shipped to Turkey during World War II and sold to Turks who wanted to invest and hedge against currency inflation, and they'd buy gold instead. So, the 2 companies are partners in the firm that owns the patents to a product called Zyklon. Zyklon was the pesticide that was used to gas people at Auschwitz and Majdanek. So how do you go from a situation where in 1932, these companies, the leaders of these companies don't agree with Adolf Hitler, they don't want to sign up for his movement, they aren't part of the 37%. By 1942, they're behaving as if they had always been part of the 37%, and they were happy to participate in all of these things. The answer is that the Nazis were brilliant at creating a murderous society. And they did it in the course of the 30s in 3 ways. Intimidation. They scared people into conformity. There's a famous guy named Sebastian Haffner, who was himself a German. He was studying in 1933 when the Nazis came in for his law boards. And he fled the country in 1938 and wrote a memoir called The Story of a German. In English, it's called Defying Hitler, but originally it's just called The Story of a German. He tells a story of this day when he was in the library in the spring of 1943 at the law courts in Berlin, and he was studying for his law boards. And all of a sudden, the stormtroopers burst into the library, a lot of guys in brown shirts. And they go to every table where people are sitting and studying, and they slam on the table, and they say, "Are you an Aryan?" Which means, are you not a Jew? Are you a non-Jew? And if they didn't believe your answer, or if you said no, they beat you up and threw you out the window or down the stairs and so on. This was the intimidation side. Hafner also tells a story about walking with his girlfriend down a street in the center of Berlin called the Wilhelmstrasse, which is a government street. And a group of stormtroopers, they walk by on the street. So it's a formation of guys in brown shirts, and they've got a swastika flag. And when people on the sidewalk did not lift their arm like this, guys would fall out of the marching unit and beat them up. And no police unit would interfere to stop this. No, there would be no recourse to the courts. So this is the intimidation side. And then he tells the story of having, all people who were studying in 1933 and every year thereafter for a teaching certificate. So they would be allowed to teach in elementary school or secondary school. Before they could complete that process, they had to go to Nazi boot camp in the summer. You went to some little set of barracks out in the middle of the sandbox, and you drilled, and you listened to ideological lessons, and you listened to lectures that tell you that the Jews are the corrupting force of all human history, and so on and so forth. And this was a precondition for just doing ordinary things, being a school teacher, becoming a lawyer, so on and so forth. So that's intimidation and a little bit of the indoctrination, because you have to go to the boot camp and you have to listen to all this. And then there was intoxication. Because the Nazis, with all their parades and their pageantry and their speeches and so forth, were constantly saying to Germans, all those outsiders have beaten up on you for the last 20 years, but you are better than that. You are somebody again. You are the number one people. You are superior. And so this great orgy of belonging was developed in the society. We all feel good about ourselves, and the only price of that is we have to feel bad about them, the ones who are defined out of the community of ourselves. And as part of the conformity, we have to participate in the persecution of them. And we define our superiority by their misery. And this is the state the Nazis created. And so by 1942, when they have made the decision that they are going to try to kill people, German society is remarkably conformist. I mean, there's this intermediate stage, to give you an illustration, there's this intermediate stage in starts in late 1938. Jews' bank accounts and all of their property in Germany were essentially frozen. So if you had a checking account or a savings account at a bank, you were, by government decree, as a Jew, you were allowed to take only a certain amount of money out of that account every month to pay your bills. No more. Who enforced that? Who made sure that a Jewish family had only 300 marks a month to live on? Not the SS, not the Gestapo, the bank tellers. The people, you would go into your bank and you would try to get the money to pay the light bill, and if it was over 300 marks, this civilian, not necessarily a Nazi, obeying instructors from his or her superiors, would tell you, you're over the limit. No. So this is the way the society became collectively participants in the persecution. And then by 1942, in the killing, or the willingness to accept the killing, because many people knew what was happening, not necessarily in their own cities anymore, because the Jews were being deported to places where they were killed, but knew what was happening outside. But why then do the Nazis decide that they want to kill? Why does this moment come at the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 1940s? And the reason, I think, boils down to something that even the Nazis themselves, and Hitler and Himmler and so forth, did not initially understand. They wanted two entirely contradictory things. On the one hand, Hitler said the way to fix the problems of these societies, this society, is we remove the Jews. We create a Jew-free Germany. It will be strong, it will be safe, and so on. And so they tried, during the 1930s, to drive Jews out of Germany. And eventually, 2/3 of the Jews of Germany get away. 60% of the Jews of Germany itself, and then 2/3 of the Jews of Austria, which Germany annexes. So, roughly 62, 63% of the whole. But they can't get rid of all of them. Why? Because places like us won't take them. The United States took, altogether from 1933 to 1945, about 225,000 European Jews in. That's more than any other country took in on the globe. But 225,000 is tiny compared to 6 million ultimate victims. So, countries would let in some people, but not very many, and they had all kinds of, I'll come to this in a minute, they had all kinds of excuses as to why they wouldn't let in more. But the real problem was, as the Nazis began to realize as you get to the end of the 1930s, they want a Jew-free Germany. That is, they want to drive all the Jews out. But they also want living space. They want to expand Germany so that it has supposedly enough territory to support its people. Where do they want to expand? They want to expand into Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, what is now Belarus, Ukraine. This happens to be the place in the world where in 1938-39 there were more Jews than anywhere else. It was the most thickly settled with Jews spot on the globe. Why? Because this is the old Pale of Settlement within the Russian Empire, before the Russian Empire was broken up and made into all those separate countries. And that was the area that the Tsars confined the Jews to. So the Germans began to realize in 1938-39, as they started to expand, that they were in a sense chasing their own tails. They wanted a Jew-free empire, and the empire was where all the Jews were. And so leaders of the Nazi Party begin to use a different word. The word entfernen, to remove, begins to give way to a new word. And Hitler, in fact, uttered it in a speech to the Reichstag on January 30th, 1939. He said, if we have the outbreak of a new world war, it will not lead to Germany's defeat, but it will lead to the annihilation of the Jewish people in Europe. Die Vernichtung, and the verb is vernichten, entfernen, vernichten. And so they begin to say, the policy is going to be killing. But at this moment, in 1939, it's always with a conditional clause. If war comes, if something happens, we will be forced to kill them. And by 1941, when they invade the Soviet Union, they concluded that there is no other way to remove them other than to kill them. So why couldn't or didn't anyone stop it? Once the Nazis had made this terrible decision, and they had virtually a whole society behind them to do it. Why couldn't or didn't anyone stop it? Well, start with the Jews themselves. They were too divided internally to be able to understand what was happening to them. Now and they were too powerless. Remember what I said about, have you ever been on the receiving end of a tank or a flamethrower? When the Germans poured into these occupied areas of Eastern Europe, Jews had to figure out two things very fast. They had to figure out, what are they going to do with us? And what's the most sensible way to deal with that? Now that would have been hard for any homogeneous community. But one of the things that often Christians don't understand about Judaism is it's a very internally diverse and heterogeneous faith. All Jews do not believe in the same rituals, although they believe in the same texts. They don't have the same practices. And a friend of mine in high school said to me, because I was raised as a Roman Catholic, but he explained to me one day, he said, Peter, every Jew has two synagogues, the one he goes to and the one he wouldn't be caught dead in. And if you go to the old ghetto of Krakow in Poland, you will literally see why, because they are right beside each other. There are different so-called shuls right beside each other. One of them is Orthodox, one of them is Reformed, one of them is Hasidic. There were all of these it's sort of like, different denominations of Protestantism, if you will, to get a comparison. Then you add to the fact that Jews were also divided between secular people. There were some Jews who had given up the religion altogether, and then these different religious groups. And then they were divided politically. There were some who were leftists and some that were extremely conservative. And then they were divided about whether their future was in the societies where they lived, to stay in Poland and Lithuania and so forth, and the people who said, no, the future is in Zion, the land of Palestine, the Zionists who wanted to emigrate and found a Jewish state. So when the Germans descended upon these people, all of these different groups within Judaism had different traditions, different organizations, different leaders, sometimes even different schools, different hospitals, different orphanages. And all of a sudden they had to work together to figure out the answer to those two questions. What are they going to do with this, and what's the best way to react? Well, it took time to overcome the differences, and by the time many of those differences were overcome through life in the ghettos, the Germans were inexorably bearing down on them. And the Germans had all the guns, the Germans had all the firepower, and the Germans knew where things were going, whereas the people in the ghettos had to just guess. What are our chances? How do we play for time? How can we do that? So on and so on. So the first answer is the Jews themselves had a very hard time dealing with what was happening to them. The second answer is the Germans developed a very rapid and cheap way of dealing with this process. It's stunning. We think of the Holocaust as this industrial process by which, Auschwitz is a kind of disassembly line. Human beings arrive at Auschwitz in freight cars. The Germans take everything they have and plan to recycle it. You go to the concentration camp in Lublin, Majdanek, to this day, you can see barracks full of shoes. Barracks full of shoes. Hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes. Why are they there? Because Majdanek was the recycling center of the death camps of Poland. All the leather was to be sent there to be repurposed into other things. All the clothing taken off the Jews when they arrived was given to German resettlers from various parts of the continent. There's a macabre story about one day at Auschwitz where all the baby carriages that had been collected from the deportation trains were marched down to the railroad sidings to be loaded on trains to be sent back to Germany to be given away to people. Thousands of them. So it's a disassembly line. People come in and all their goods are taken away, and then they are marched into these gas chambers where they are killed, and then their bodies are stripped. The gold and the silver is taken out of their teeth. They're burned, but the bones don't always burn. So when the bones were taken out of the ash heaps or out of the furnaces, the bones were ground up and sold as fertilizer. So we think of this as this industrial process, but in fact, and the image, the most popular or widespread image of the gassing process is that red brick gate at Birkenau. You know, you have in your mind's eye the picture of the train goes under the archway and goes through the gate at Birkenau. That didn't even exist until the spring of 1944. The only Jews killed at Auschwitz who actually went under that archway were the Hungarian Jews who were deported in 1944. Up until then, two things happened. Originally, they didn't even have a spur that ran into the camp. People got off the trains at the main station in the village of Oswiecim, Auschwitz, and marched across an open field. And guess what the gas chambers were? The original gas chambers were two peasant houses at the other side of the field that the Germans took over, and then they sealed up the windows, they put rubber fittings around the doors, and they converted these houses in essence to gas chambers. And with the Zyklon, the gas that you kill people, it comes in cans. In the cans are pellets that have been soaked in a liquid called hydrocyanic acid. Now, when oxygen comes in contact with those pellets, the liquid vaporizes, and it makes a gas that will kill you. So they come in these cans, and what the SS men would do is you'd pack the people into the peasant cottage. You would, a guy with a gas mask would stand there and pop holes in the top of the can. They had a special device. It was like a cylinder with claws on the end of it. And you went down like that, did that, threw the can in, closed the windows. And everybody in there would die very shortly. About a 33rd of an ounce will kill a 150-pound person in about 2 minutes. This stuff was incredibly cheap. It's okay. 2.2 pounds, which is 1 kilogram, was the unit that they sold it in. And that could kill about 1,500 people. And that cost a little over 5 marks. So what I'm telling you is that they retrofit buildings that are already there. They march people across the long field. They pack them in there. They throw in a substance that they already have because they used it to fumigate SS men's barracks and army barracks and U-boats and so forth, and it's cheap. And at the other camps that used carbon monoxide, that is exhaust fumes, they used the captured motors of Soviet tanks. So they just hooked those up with pipes to the confined area in which they kept the people who were going to be killed, and all you needed was gasoline to run these things, and that would pump the exhaust fumes in and people would die. A great illustration of how improvised the whole thing was is that in the summer of 1942, the German offensive was marching toward Stalingrad, and the deliveries of people to the death camps were suspended for 4 weeks, I think, because it wasn't so much that they needed the boxcars and the freight cars, but it was because there was so much traffic on the roads going to the German armies that they didn't want any other traffic happening. And in that interval, the commandant of the camp at Treblinka, almost 900,000 people were gassed at Treblinka. Imagine, almost 1 million people. And Treblinka was operated with these Soviet captured tank engines. Well, the original gas chambers that they had built there were improvised. They were made out of 2 rows of wood, vertical, a layer of sand in between, and a tar paper covering. Now, this is going to sound flippant, but you could buy this stuff at Home Depot. Those were the first gas chambers. In this period where they suspended them, the deliveries, they said to the commandant at Treblinka and a couple of other camps, they said, look, use this time to make bigger gas chambers that are sturdy and can kill more people and so on. So what did the commandant of Treblinka do to get the materials to build a bigger gas chamber? Did he send an order into Berlin saying, I want X number of tons of cement, and I want you to ship me bricks and so on and so forth, and mortar and blah? No. He realized that right down the railroad line that turned off toward Treblinka, that they used for the deliveries, at the junction, in a little village called Malkinia, there was an old factory with a giant red brick chimney. And he blew it up. And he used the bricks to build the new gas chamber. It cost him nothing. Now, so you get a sense the Germans developed this cheap system of transporting large numbers of people. And of course, you know, it wasn't hard to transport large numbers of people, 1,000 people at a time or 2,000 in these shipments, because you just crammed them into the freight cars. You didn't worry about feeding them or giving them water or anything. And you didn't worry about when they arrived. People joke about, you know, the trains arriving at the death camps on time. They almost never did. It didn't matter. The Germans didn't care whether those people died in the boxcars or the freight cars on the way, or whether they died in the gas chambers, just as long as they were en route. So this meant that the whole process was improvised. It was relatively spontaneous. It was incredibly cheap. And that's another reason why no one could stop it, because and here is the geography. Now, if I had a map behind me, I could do this, but we'll do it with my torso, okay? If you think of a map of the continental United States, and I ask you to stick your finger in the middle of the continental United States, your finger will be in Kansas somewhere, right? Okay, now, analogy, or now think of Europe. You want to stick your finger in the middle of a map of continental Europe. You will basically hit Vienna. Okay, now I'm going to do this from your point of view. This is Vienna. Now draw a line from Vienna east horizontally. And draw a line from Vienna north vertically. You have just marked off, over here, the northeast quadrant of the European continent. Okay? All the death camps were here. The only place in Europe where there were Allied bombers while this carnage was occurring. Remember, 50% die in those 11 months leading up to February of 1943. 3/4 are dead by 1943 because there are people who died before the 11 months. The only bombers available are over here. This is Great Britain. Now, while the Holocaust was in full fury, while the massacres were at their highest, you could not get a bomber from here to any of those places and back on a single tank of gas. You could not bomb them. And we became capable of bombing Auschwitz only in the spring of 1944 because we got to here, my belly button, which is down the boot of Italy. We captured an Italian naval base called Foggia. And then we could fly from there up to Auschwitz and back on a single tank of gas. But by March and April of 1944, almost everyone was dead. And so one of the reasons why we couldn't stop this is time and space. Because most of the murders are occurring while the Germans are winning the war, while they're expanding, and while we literally can't retaliate. And when we finally become capable of reaching the camp, then American and British military leaders decide not to do it. Because they think, and this is going to lead to my third explanation of why nobody stopped this. Why couldn't or didn't anyone stop it? The short answer is because every party that could have thought it had something more important to do. At any given moment, something more important to do. Why do those military leaders stop the bombers going from here to there? Because at that moment, in May and June of 1944, the killing at Auschwitz is not the only thing going on. What else occurred in June of 1944? Please, somebody. D-Day. D-Day. The invasion of Europe. We forget, because we live here. But if you lived in Great Britain, the other end, you would have immediately gotten not only D-Day, May and June of 1944 is when the V-1s and the V-2s were raining down on London. And then there was also when we landed in June of 1944 in Normandy, the Russians launched a massive attack on the Eastern Front called Operation Bagration. And we promised to support that by hitting all the German fuel installations that we could do. So the military leaders, when they were presented with the requests to bomb Auschwitz, they all said, well, we can't do that. We have more important things to do. We have to bomb all the bridges in France so the Germans can't send reinforcements up. We have to take out the launching sites of the V1s and the V2s. We have to hit all of the oil plants and so forth. They always had something more important. Even when you talk about American immigration policy in the 1930s, why didn't we let more Jews in? I used to cite to my class because this is a fine example of what your students can teach you. One of my students, maybe the fourth or fifth year I taught the course, I was talking about American immigration policy, and the student had the sense to go look back at the student newspaper at Northwestern in 1938 to 39 to see what it was saying about refugees and letting Jews in. And what it was reporting is that a national student poll had said 75% of American students were against letting more people in because they'd compete for jobs, because they were perceived as, and the arguments against immigration were arguments that you will find very, very familiar. They'll take your jobs, they'll cost you money, and there will be terrorists among them. Only in those days, they said spies. They said because, you let in Jews from Germany and they'll have relatives still back in the old country who the Nazis can squeeze. And the Nazis will tell the people who you're letting in that we'll be bad to your relatives unless you spy for us. And this was the boogeyman that people created. And then beyond that, the other boogeyman was, it's not just the German Jews. Yeah, there are only 500,000 German Jews. In America in those days, there were 130 million people. Now we have 180 million more than that. We could have easily let in 500,000 German Jews. But at the same time, the governments of Poland, where there were 3.5 million Jews, and Romania, where there were almost 1 million, were approaching the League of Nations, the United Nations of its day, and asking other countries to help them reduce their Jewish populations. So the argument that was used here in America was, if you let them in, how are you going to say no to the Polish Jews? How are you going to say no to the Romanians? We'll be flooded. And the argument was, we have to look out for ourselves. I'll give you one more example because I'm getting to the point where I've talked too much. But I said to you, I was raised as a Roman Catholic. My full name is Peter Francis Hayes. Now, they could have given me a more Catholic or Irish name, I suppose. They could have named me Dennis Patrick or Francis Xavier. But Peter Francis Hayes is pretty Catholic. And there's a Cardinal Hayes High School in Chicago to prove it. So I was raised in the Catholic Church. And one of the things that I have devoted particular attention over the years in studying the Holocaust is why the Catholic Church was so unresponsive. Why the Pope didn't intervene or speak up. Why more refuge wasn't offered to Jews. And there was some opening of monasteries and so forth, but usually on the condition, we'll take in your children if you let us baptize them. So there was always, but there was some of this. But anyway, when you were trying, the Pope himself, Pius XII, from 1939 until the early 60s, that Pius XII was himself a Germanophile. He had been stationed in Germany as a papal representative. He learned the language. Many of you will find this impossible to understand, but Pius XII actually fell in love with the German language. And if you've watched a lot of war movies, you sort of say, huh? How could anyone possibly fall in love with this guttural tongue? But in fact, I fell in love with the German language when I was young. It's an extremely, it doesn't all sound like the bad movies. It's an extremely challenging language grammatically. Pius XII was fascinated by the language. He thought he loved the landscape. He was fond of the Germans. He was terrified of communism. And he thought the Nazis were a bulwark against communism. But here, under the heading of, everybody always thought they had something more important to do. Remember, Pius XII was a priest. And in the Catholic theology of the day, it's very important to understand how you got to heaven in Catholic teaching. Now, when I was raised in the Catechism, and it changed after Vatican II, but remember, this is before Vatican II. When I was raised in the Catechism, what you were taught is very simple. There is no salvation without the sacraments. You cannot go to heaven without having been baptized, gone to communion, had confirmation, had the opportunity to marry or take orders, to practice confession, and then at the end, to have the holy oil. Those are the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. The teaching was there is no route to heaven without the sacraments. And this would lead to awkward questions when I was in Sunday school. Can Protestants go to heaven? Well, they sort of have sacraments. You know, they don't believe that when the communion wafer goes on your tongue that it is the body and blood of Jesus, but they think it's a symbol of that. So that's okay. And then you would say, well, can Jews go to heaven? And the nuns would kind of act a little nervous. Now, for Pius XII, the whole reason for the Catholic Church to exist is to get you to heaven. The life you and I are experiencing at this moment in Catholic teaching is artificial. The real life is after you die. This is just an audition. This is just how you decide, how you prove that you're fit to be saved and be in heaven for the rest. Okay? Now, if there's no salvation without the sacraments, and if the chief mission of the church is to save you, then there's one intermediate step. Where do you get the sacraments? You cannot order them on Amazon. In fact, you get them from somebody. You can't give yourself communion. You can't in the Catholic Church, though you can in Protestant churches, confess to yourself or to God. You have to go to the priest. For all of the sacraments, you need a priest. And the point, therefore, is if there's no salvation without the sacraments, there's no salvation without a priest to dispense them. And that means the absolute chief priority of the Holy Father of the Catholic Church is to keep the churches open and the priests there. And the difference, he hated the communists, and he hated them more than the Nazis. What's the difference? The communists close the churches, they turn them into stables, they make it impossible to save souls. The Nazis send some priests to Dachau if they think they're unreliable and so forth, but they don't close churches. They leave the operation open. And for Pius XII, in the end, this was always the decisive thing. And he would always say, if I speak up against what the Nazis are doing, then there's a chance they'll close the churches. And the whole reason for being... Now, what I want you to understand about this is, you see, it comes under the heading of, I had something more important to do. And everybody who could have intervened always was able to tell themselves they had something more important to do. The Red Cross, headquartered in Geneva, said absolutely nothing about the death camps, though its head in Geneva in 1942 knew about the gassings almost from the moment they started. Why not? Why didn't the Red Cross speak up or spread the word and so forth? Because the Red Cross thought its principal mission is to deliver packages to prisoners of war behind all the lines. To Allied POWs behind the German lines, to German POWs behind the other lines. That's why the Red Cross was founded. And so the leaders of the Red Cross said, we can't speak up because it will endanger our principal mission. Okay, so this is what I tried to do in the book, is to explain things that we find so difficult to explain. How could this unfold the way it did? How could it have been so massively destructive? And how could they get away with it in this tiny period of time with such enormous consequence? And the point I'm trying to make is it can be explained. It is not outside of history. It's not different from trying to figure out why the Civil War happened or why World War I broke out. But it's hard, and it involves us looking at some of the worst excuses human beings use for not taking care of each other. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.